Welcome to stop number 3 on the South State Street Manufactured Gas Plant virtual tour. I'm Eleanor Hines with Resources. For this stop, you should be standing at the lookout where the old walkway went over the train tracks. Isn't it a great view? Looking out, you can see the lower portion of the site with Bellingham Bay in the background. Some of the site actually extends out into the bay, which we will talk about later. To your right and behind you, you can see the upper portion of the site. The upper and lower portions are divided by a steep embankment with the BNSF railroad tracks at the bottom of the slope. I'm here to tell you more about the MTCA, or Model Toxics Control Act process. June 22nd through July 21st of 2020 is an open comment period on the Draft Cleanup Action Plan, which is part of the MTCA process, so you may want to know a little bit more about MTCA. Stay tuned for the last stop on this virtual tour for more details on how to stay up to speed with what's happening at this site, other sites, and how to participate in the public comment process. MTCA was passed as a Washington State Citizens Initiative in 1988 with the intent of speeding up the cleanups of our state's legacy contaminated sites. Today, Bellingham Bay has 12 MTCA sites, the South State Street Manufactured Gas Plant site here at Boulevard Park along the Interurban Trail being one of those. The MTCA process starts with what's called site discovery. Someone has to first identify that a site may be contaminated and report it to Washington Department of Ecology. Ecology then conducts what's called an initial investigation to evaluate the potential risk to human health and the environment at the site based on exposure potential and severity of the hazard. For example, was the reported oil sheen the result of a leaking underground storage tank, or was it just a few drops of oil spilled? The initial investigation determines if or what further steps may need to be taken if there is a human or environmental risk. The next step or steps is then to conduct a remedial investigation and feasibility study. These are done by consultants that work with ecology and the potential liable persons, or PLPs, who play a major role in the cleanup. Here, the PLPs are the City of Bellingham and Puget Sound Energy, who inherited this gas plant. Many times, as was the case for this site in the fall of 2018, these two steps are combined into a single report and put out for public comment. The remedial investigation looks at the nature and extent of contamination, i.e., where the contamination may have traveled to, as well as potential impacts to human health and the environment. During this process, the site boundaries are also determined based on the extent and concentrations of contaminants tied to the identified historical uses. Here, the contamination was determined to be derived from historical processes involved with the manufactured gas plant discussed in the historical uses and contamination video. So any contamination associated with the manufactured gas plant in the remedial investigation was considered part of the site. In the feasibility study, an array of cleanup actions are presented. Each cleanup presented meets MTCA standards, meaning that they all clean up and address contaminant exposure to ensure human health and environmental protection. These alternative cleanups usually range from placing a cap or a barrier over the contamination, treating contamination in place, to full removal of the contamination with variations in between. What's called a preferred alternative is selected from the list of cleanups based on a disproportionate cost analysis that identifies which cleanup plan will get the most protection and benefits for the money spent on the cleanup. During the public comment period, folks can comment on these alternatives, and Ecology will address each comment submitted in the process, as already happened for this site. During this process, Alternative 2 was the preferred alternative and remains so after the public comment period. The Draft Cleanup Action Plan is the next step, and also has a public comment period too. The Alternative 2 cleanup plan for the feasibility study is filled out in finer detail in the Draft Cleanup Action Plan. As mentioned earlier, there is a public comment period open for this Draft Cleanup Action Plan, and is why we are hosting this virtual tour. We hope that you'll gain a better sense of the site and submit your comment. John Gunther from the Department of Ecology will talk more about what the Cleanup Action Plan entails in upcoming stops on this virtual tour. After the Cleanup Action Plan, the next step is to refine the Cleanup Action Plan even more with the Engineering Design Report, which dives deeper into details of construction for the cleanup plan. Following the Engineering Design Report is the actual cleanup where construction happens on site to get the site cleaned up. The final cleanup will be done under another legal agreement, which will also be available for public review and comment. Once the site has been cleaned up, monitoring and site use controls are then implemented. Monitoring makes sure the cleanup action plan worked as intended, while site use controls restrict and prohibit activities that could disturb the cleanup. And finally, periodic reviews, typically 5 years after the cleanup, are done to ensure the cleanup meets standards and requirements. These periodic reviews are also open to public review and comment. If these are met, then the next step is to remove the site from the hazardous site list. At any time during this process, what's called an interim action may occur to partially address contamination. This will be talked about later on this tour. Next up, John Gunther from Ecology will talk about the site's upland contamination at the concrete gas holder tank foundation. So keep following the virtual tour.